name is Eliza. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my career, I've been described with the same 3 words: reliable, calm, and easy to work with. I live in Seattle now, though I didn't grow up here. I work in corporate strategy for a mid-sized tech firm, the kind of place where meetings happen about meetings, and decisions are often made before anyone says them out loud. On paper, my job is to optimize operational efficiency. In reality, I fix problems people don't want attached to their names. If you met me in the hallway, you probably wouldn't look twice. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't posture. I don't need credit in real time. I take notes. I ask one precise question, and then I go back to my desk and make sure the numbers actually work. That's how they saw me: dependable, composed, non-threatening. What they didn't see was how carefully I was observing everything. This isn't a story about revenge. There was no dramatic showdown, no shouting, no slammed doors. There were no villains twirling metaphorical mustaches in glass conference rooms. This is a story about what happens when you realize you've been underestimated for so long that it's become part of the company culture. It's about the quiet moment when you ask for what you've earned and people laugh. Not cruelly, not maliciously, just dismissively. It's about the slow accumulation of small cuts that don't bleed enough to justify outrage, but sting enough that you never quite forget them. And it's about what happens when silence stops being compliance and becomes strategy. There was a day I asked for a raise. They laughed. A competitor doubled my salary. My resignation email hit their inbox the same day. But this story isn't about the email. It's about everything that led to it. The years of being the invisible backbone, the subtle rewrites of credit, the meetings where my ideas came back to me wearing someone else's voice. Most importantly, it's about the internal shift the moment I stopped trying to be understood and started making decisions. I'm not angry anymore. I wasn't even angry then. I was clear. And clarity, I've learned, is much more powerful than emotion. If you've ever been the person who holds everything together while being treated as replaceable, you might recognize parts of yourself in this. Have you ever noticed how easily people mistake quiet for small? To them, I was the steady one. That's how my manager, Greg, introduced me to new hires. This is Eliza. If you need something done right, she's your person. It always sounded like praise. And in some ways, my projects rarely went off the rails. My forecasts were conservative but accurate. I anticipated friction before it became visible. I stayed late when necessary, but never made a show of it. I didn't compete for airtime in meetings. I waited until the room tired itself out, then summarized what actually mattered. Over time, that predictability became my brand. When deadlines tightened, they handed it to me. When a client escalated, I stepped in. When another team dropped the ball, I helped smooth it over. What I didn't notice at first was the pattern underneath. The high visibility presentations assigned to someone more dynamic. The conference panels, someone more energetic. The innovation task force, someone more visionary. I was the stabilizer, the safety net, the quiet insurance policy. And insurance policies don't get celebrated. They're just expected. In meetings, I'd often present a risk analysis, detailed, structured, practical. There would be nods, maybe a quick, "Great work, Eliza." Then someone else would restate my conclusion 10 minutes later, louder, sharper, distilled into a slogan. And suddenly it was a bold insight. I learned not to flinch. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it harder to protest. No one was actively pushing me down. They just weren't pulling me up either. There's a specific kind of invisibility that happens when you're competent and calm. People assume you're fine. They assume you don't need reinforcement. They assume you're not ambitious because you're not loud. Once, during a performance review, Greg smiled and said, "You're invaluable, Eliza. Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without you." I remember sitting there, hands folded over my black notebook, and thinking, then why does it feel like I'm standing still? My title hadn't changed in 3 years. My responsibilities had doubled. I was unofficially mentoring 2 analysts. I was looped into crisis calls that technically weren't even in my scope anymore. But because I handled it without complaint, it became invisible labor. There's something almost hypnotic about being the easy one. You start to internalize it. You tell yourself, it's fine. They trust you. You're respected. Just keep building. And I did build. I built systems. I built trust across departments. I built a reputation for precision. If someone needed historical data on a project from 2 years ago, I had it. If someone misremembered a timeline, I could gently correct it with receipts. But I wasn't building leverage, at least not intentionally. To them, I was safe, predictable, loyal, the kind of employee who would never rock the boat. And because I never raised my voice, they assumed I would never raise my expectations. Looking back, I don't think they underestimated my intelligence. They underestimated my threshold. They thought quiet meant compliant. They thought steady meant static. They thought dependable meant permanent. And for a long time, I let them. Not because I was weak, but because I believed that good work would eventually speak for itself. I just didn't realize that in some rooms, work doesn't speak. People do. The first time it happened, it was almost forgettable. That's how small it was. We were in a quarterly planning meeting glass walls, catered salads no one touched, slides with gradients that tried very hard to look innovative. I had spent 2 weeks analyzing a bottleneck in our client onboarding process. It was costing us time, money, and reputation, quietly, repeatedly. I didn't just identify the problem. I built a phased solution, realistic, cost-contained, implementable within a quarter. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. No theatrics, just facts. If we restructure the intake sequence and automate the compliance verification here, I said, pointing to the slide, we reduce processing time by 18%, conservatively. There were nods, a few impressed eyebrows. Greg leaned back in his chair. That's solid, he said. And then Daniel, recently hired, MBA polished, very comfortable with eye contact, leaned forward. What if, he said, we reposition this as a client acceleration initiative? The room shifted. He restated my proposal, almost word for word, but with sharper phrasing. He added a tagline. He spoke faster, louder. Within minutes, the conversation had pivoted. This could be your project. Daniel. Someone said, I love the energy around this. Another added, let's have you spearhead the rollout. I remember sitting there, hands folded over my notebook. No one looked at me. It wasn't that they erased me. My slides were still on the screen. My name was on the footer. It was subtler than that. The ownership just migrated. I told myself it didn't matter. The idea was what counted. Impact on ego. That's what mature professionals believe, right? After the meeting, Daniel caught up with me by the coffee machine. Great groundwork in there, he said casually. I'll loop you in as we build it out. Groundwork. Like I'd poured the concrete, and he was choosing the paint color. I smiled. Of course. And I meant it, at least partially. I wasn't territorial. If the project succeeded, the company benefited. I benefited. Except that's not how it played out. Over the next few weeks, Daniel led updates. He presented progress to leadership. He became associated with the Client Acceleration Initiative. My involvement was mentioned occasionally, usually as support. I still did the heavy lifting, the data modeling, the risk mitigation, the troubleshooting when automation misfired. But in the executive summary emails, his name came first. It was such a small cut. No confrontation, no betrayal, just a subtle redistribution of visibility. And here's the part that stayed with me. No one thought it was wrong. Not Greg, not the executives, not even Daniel, I suspect. They saw someone confident, taking initiative, and someone reliable supporting it. A natural pairing. I went home one evening and opened my laptop. Not to work, but to reread the original proposal deck, my timestamps, my notes, the version history. Proof, but for what? I wasn't planning to argue. I wasn't drafting an angry email. I just needed to confirm something to myself. I hadn't imagined it. That was the first moment I started documenting differently, not defensively, just precisely dates, ownership, language used in meetings, who committed to what. I didn't know why yet. I wasn't plotting an exit. I wasn't thinking about leverage. I was simply adjusting my awareness. The cut was small, but I felt it. And once you feel the first one, you start noticing the rest. After that first meeting, I told myself something that sounded mature. Don't be sensitive. It became a quiet mantra. Not because anyone said I was, but because I didn't want to be the kind of person who needed recognition to function. I had always prided myself on being above that. So when it happened again, I absorbed it faster, and it did happen again. A cross-functional roadmap I had built over a month was presented by Greg at the executive level without me in the room. We streamlined our interdepartmental alignment. He said, later, in the hallway. He clapped my shoulder lightly. Saved us in there. They loved it. Saved us. There's a strange emotional math you start doing in environments like that. You weigh visibility against security. You measure ego against stability. I was well paid, not exceptionally, but comfortably. I had autonomy, flexibility, a team that respected me. Was it worth making noise over attribution? Every time the answer was probably not. So I adjusted internally. When my ideas resurfaced with someone else's voice, I told myself the right people know. When I wasn't invited to higher-level strategy sessions that directly relied on my data, I rationalized they're protecting my time. When Daniel was promoted to Director of Strategic Initiatives, less than 2 years after joining largely on the back of the onboarding project, I attended the celebration lunch and genuinely congratulated him. And I meant it. That's the complicated part. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't secretly seething. I just kept working. But something subtle was happening under the surface. I stopped volunteering as quickly. I still delivered. I just didn't overextend without being asked. I started noticing language more carefully. Can you take care of this? You're so good at cleaning these things up. You're the glue here. Glue. Glue doesn't get promoted. Glue holds other things together. One afternoon, I overheard 2 junior managers talking near the break room. If you need it done right, give it to Eliza. One said, yeah, the other laughed. She'll fix it and not even complain. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant for me to hear, but it landed, not even complain. That was part of my brand. I went back to my desk and opened my notebook. Not angrily, just thoughtfully. I wrote 1 sentence at the top of a blank page. What am I teaching them about my limits? That question lingered longer than any slight, because the truth was I had trained them. I trained them that I would step in quietly, that I didn't need spotlight, that I wouldn't push back publicly. My satisfaction came from systems running smoothly, not titles shifting upward, and companies respond to patterns. If you never express dissatisfaction, they assume you're satisfied. If you never negotiate, they assume you're content. If you never threaten to leave, they assume you won't. I wasn't being disrespected loudly. I was being deprioritized silently. And the more it happened, the more normal it felt. That's how culture forms, not through dramatic moments, but through repetition. No one ever said, Eliza doesn't deserve more. They just kept choosing someone else when it was time to attach a face to progress. And because I didn't object, the pattern solidified. Still, I told myself timing matters. Stay patient. Build more proof. But patience without boundaries isn't strength. It's permission. And I was beginning to understand that, not with anger, with clarity. There's a moment in every long-term role when you realize you're no longer being evaluated based on potential. You're being managed based on predictability. For me, that realization came quietly during a leadership offsite I wasn't invited to. It wasn't an oversight. The calendar invite simply never came. I found out about it when Greg mentioned, casually, we aligned on next year's vision yesterday. Aligned. On a vision largely built from the data models I'd constructed. I nodded. Sounds productive. It was, he said, we kept it tight, just directors and up. Just directors and up. Daniel had been promoted 3 months earlier. I wasn't upset in that moment. Not visibly. Not even internally at first. I just felt something settle into place. I knew my role. I wasn't being groomed for strategic visibility. I was being optimized for operational stability. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing how often my name came up in a specific context. Let's run that by Eliza before finalizing. Have Eliza sanity check the numbers. Eliza can smooth that over. I was the validator, the corrector, the quiet safety mechanism behind louder decisions. And the more reliable I proved, the more firmly the role solidified. There's a comfort executives feel when they know someone will absorb pressure without escalating it. I became that person. If timelines were unrealistic, I adjusted mine. If expectations shifted mid-quarter, I recalibrated without public friction. Not because I lacked opinions, but because I valued composure. At some point, though, composure became conflated with complacency. During my annual review that year, Greg leaned back in his chair and gave me what he clearly thought was high praise. "You're our backbone," he said. "You don't need titles. You just make things work." I held eye contact. "You don't need titles." It was framed as a compliment, a testament to my intrinsic value. But titles aren't about ego. They're about leverage, compensation, decision-making authority, protection. Backbone doesn't get equity. Backbone gets responsibility. That was the role I had been assigned, the steady infrastructure. The one who wouldn't threaten the hierarchy because she wasn't visibly chasing it. And here's the part that stung more than anything. They weren't entirely wrong. I hadn't chased it. I had waited for merit to convert naturally into mobility. I believed consistency would be noticed and rewarded. Instead, consistency became an expectation. Reliability became an obligation. Invisibility became efficiency. One afternoon, I was reviewing a hiring plan when I saw a budget allocation for a new strategic innovation lead. The salary band was significantly higher than mine. The job description, half of it was built on initiatives I'd already implemented. I stared at the screen for a long time, not angry, just aware. They weren't building a path upward for me. They were building around me. And the most dangerous part of being indispensable in the wrong way is this. You become too useful to promote, too stable to risk, too quiet to prioritize. That was the role I had been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible. And for the first time, I didn't rationalize it. I simply acknowledged it. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen after a promotion announcement or a performance review. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:40 in my kitchen. I was standing barefoot on cold tile, waiting for the kettle to boil, scrolling through my inbox before work, a habit I had told myself I'd stop. There was an email from HR with the subject line, Annual Compensation Review Notice. I already knew what it would say. 3%, market adjustment, recognition of continued excellence. We appreciate your contributions. I opened it anyway. 3.2% was to be precise. I stared at the number longer than necessary. Inflation that year was higher than that. My responsibilities had expanded again, unofficially, leading 2 cross-functional projects, after Daniel delegated them for growth exposure. I had absorbed additional compliance oversight when another manager left. No change in title, no change in authority. A small percentage increase to reward stability. The kettle clicked off, and something in me did too. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hurt. It was the absence of illusion. For years, I had operated under a quiet belief, if I continue to deliver at this level, the structure will eventually correct itself. That morning, I realized the structure wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. I made tea, sat at the table, opened my black notebook. Instead of writing frustrations, I wrote numbers. My current salary, industry averages for my scope of work, the salary band for the strategic innovation lead role. Recruiter messages I had politely ignored over the past year. I searched my inbox. There were more than I remembered. Impressed by your background, confidential leadership opportunity, competitive compensation. I hadn't entertained them because loyalty felt like integrity, because leaving without trying to fix things first felt impulsive. But sitting there that morning, I asked myself a different question. What if loyalty without reciprocity is just self-discounting? Later that day, Greg stopped by my desk. "Comp review hit your inbox," he asked casually. "Yes." "You know, budgets are tight," he added quickly. "But you're valued here." "Valued?" I looked at him not challengingly, just clearly. "I appreciate that," I said. And I did appreciate it. On a human level, I think he meant it. But appreciation without adjustment is just sentiment. That afternoon, I declined to volunteer for an additional task that would have previously landed on my plate. "I don't have the capacity to take that on effectively," I said. The words felt foreign, not aggressive, just firm. There was a brief pause on the call. Someone else offered to handle it. Nothing exploded. The sky didn't fall. That's when I realized how much of my overextension had been self-assigned. The shift wasn't about leaving yet. It was about recalibrating internally. I stopped thinking like a permanent fixture. I started thinking like a negotiator. I updated my resume that weekend. Not dramatically, just accurately. I listed outcomes, metrics, revenue impact, cost savings, process improvements. Seeing it compiled in one place did something to me. It wasn't arrogance. It was evidence. For the first time, I wasn't hoping someone would notice my value. I was measuring it. And once you measure something honestly, you can't unsee the gap. That Tuesday morning wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no ultimatums. Just tea cooling on a wooden table and a quiet decision forming. If the structure won't correct itself, I will. After that Tuesday, nothing about me looked different. I still arrived on time, still took notes, still delivered clean, structured updates. But internally, the axis had shifted. Before it, my silence came from patience. Now, it came from strategy. There's a subtle difference between not speaking because you trust the process and not speaking because you're studying it. I began listening differently in meetings. When executives discuss future leadership capacity, I noted who they mentioned and why. It was rarely about raw output. It was about perceived influence, about who shaped narratives, not just spreadsheets. When Daniel presented updates on initiatives I had built frameworks for, I didn't correct him. I didn't reclaim language. I simply documented which metrics he highlighted and which ones he avoided. Silence gave me a wider lens. The less I rushed to fill gaps, the more I saw them. Interestingly, people interpreted my recalibration as steadiness. Eliza's always so composed. Someone said during a tense call, I wasn't composed. I was disengaging from unpaid emotional labor. I stopped pre-solving problems that weren't assigned to me. If an issue didn't fall within my official scope, I waited. If no one asked for my input, I let the silence sit. At first, small cracks appeared. A deadline slipped because no one caught an assumption I would have previously flagged. A budget estimate ran optimistically without my conservative adjustment. A cross-team miscommunication escalated before someone looped me in. Each time, someone would eventually ask, did Eliza see this? And for the first time, sometimes the answer was no. Not because I was withholding, because I was no longer volunteering invisible corrections. I noticed something else, too. When I stopped overextending, no one reduced my responsibilities. They simply redistributed the overflow to others, and those others struggled. Not dramatically and not catastrophically, but noticeably. That realization was important. I wasn't irreplaceable, but I was disproportionately carrying complexity, and the system had grown accustomed to it. One afternoon, Greg stopped by again. You've been quieter lately, he observed. I'm focused, I replied. He nodded, almost approvingly. That's why we trust you. Trust. The word felt different now. Trust can mean reliance, but it can also mean assumption. They trusted I wouldn't leave. They trusted I wouldn't push. They trusted I would absorb. What they didn't see was that my silence was no longer compliance. It was data collection. I scheduled 2 exploratory calls with recruiters that week. Confidential, low pressure. I framed them as market research. Both conversations were polite, efficient. The first recruiter quoted a salary range that was 40% above my current compensation. I didn't react audibly. I just wrote it down. The second said, with your scope and cross-functional impact, you're underleveled. Underleveled? I ended the call calmly, thanked them for their time, and closed my laptop. There's a specific kind of power that comes from knowing your options even before you act on them. Back at work, I remained steady. No dramatic energy shift, no visible resentment. If anything, I seemed more centered. Because when silence is a choice, it stops feeling like suppression. It becomes control. And control is quiet. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. After those first recruiter conversations, I didn't immediately start applying everywhere. I didn't update my LinkedIn headline with cryptic signals. I didn't confide in coworkers. I prepared the same way I always worked methodically. The first thing I did was audit my own impact. Not emotionally, structurally. I pulled 3 years of performance reviews, extracted recurring themes, operational excellence, cross-functional stabilizer, trusted partner. I translated those phrases into measurable business outcomes. cost reductions, revenue acceleration, churn prevention, and time saved. Then I did something I'd never done before. I quantified the invisible. The onboarding restructure had reduced processing time by 18%, which translated to approximately $2.4 million in retained annual revenue. The compliance automation reduced legal exposure risk by a percentage that our legal team once described as material. I estimated the cost avoidance conservatively. When I finished mapping it all, the number startled even me. Not because it was inflated, because it was precise. For years, I had delivered impact without attaching scale to it. I had assumed leadership understood the magnitude. That assumption was naive. Executives don't feel effort. They feel numbers. The second thing I did was build external references quietly. I reached out to a former VP who had left the company a year earlier, framed it as catching up. During the conversation, he said something that lingered. "You always ran the real engine over there," he said casually. "Don't let them box you into operations forever." Box? That word again, different tone, same implication. I asked if he'd be comfortable serving as a reference if needed. He agreed immediately. I made a short list of others' clients, cross-functional leaders, people who had directly benefited from my work rather than just supervised it. Then I adjusted how I showed up internally. Not louder, sharper. In meetings, when someone referenced a metric I owned, I clarified calmly. To build on that, I'd say the 18% reduction came specifically from restructuring the compliance gate. Not defensive, just specific. Language matters. Attribution hides in vagueness. I also stopped solving problems verbally. Instead of offering immediate answers in meetings, I'd say, I'll follow up with a structured recommendation. That subtle shift changed perception. It repositioned my input from spontaneous support to formal expertise. People began waiting for my memos. It wasn't ego, it was reframing. At the same time, I began interviewing selectively. 3 companies, then 5. Each conversation wasn't just about them evaluating me. I evaluated them. How did they talk about leadership? How did they describe failure? Who made decisions? In one interview, a COO paused mid-conversation and said, "You think like an operator, but you speak like a strategist. That combination is rare." I didn't smile widely, but internally, something aligned. That's what I had been doing all along. They just had language for it. Back at my current company, nothing appeared different. I still delivered quarterly forecasts, still attended status meetings. But behind the scenes, I was gathering leverage. Offer ranges, title comparisons, reporting structures, equity packages. The more information I gathered, the calmer I became. Because preparation eliminates desperation. I wasn't trying to escape. I was constructing options. And the most important thing I prepared wasn't my resume. It was my posture. I practiced saying numbers out loud without softening them. I'm targeting a base salary between X and Y. Given my scope, director-level alignment makes sense. The first few times felt unnatural, almost arrogant. Then they felt factual. Meanwhile, at my company, leadership continued operating under the same assumption. Eliza is steady. Eliza is loyal. Eliza will always be here. They didn't notice that I had stopped correcting their perception. I let them believe it, because the less they sensed movement, the more room I had to make it. Preparation is quiet. Leverage grows in silence. And by the time anyone realizes you're ready, you usually already are. The offer came on a Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk, reviewing a budget variance report, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject line, offer letter, confidential. I didn't open it immediately. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I wanted to control the moment. I closed my laptop first, finished the variance adjustments, sent the follow-up summary I'd promised. Only then did I step outside. There's a small courtyard behind our building, concrete benches, a few ornamental trees trying their best in shallow soil. I sat down, opened the email, and read slowly. Director of Operational Strategy. Base salary nearly double my current compensation. Annual performance bonus. Equity. Reporting directly to the COO. I read it twice, then a third time. There was no rush of adrenaline, no triumphant surge, just clarity. The number wasn't symbolic. It wasn't an emotional victory. It was a market correction. For years, I had suspected I was underleveled. Recruiters had hinted. Industry data had suggested, but suspicion leaves room for doubt. This left none. They had assessed my background, my scope, my measurable impact, and priced it accordingly. I sat there in the quiet courtyard while employees filtered in and out behind the glass doors, unaware that the axis of my life had just shifted. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text friends. I opened my notebook. On the left page, I wrote my current compensation. On the right, the new offer. The gap wasn't just financial. It was structural. Title, authority, decision-making power. For the first time in years, the role described in a document matched the work I was already capable of performing. That was the reveal. Not that I was valuable, but the market agreed. Back inside, I attended a 3:00 status meeting. Daniel was presenting an expansion plan built on a framework I had drafted weeks earlier. As he spoke, I studied him, not with resentment, but with detachment. He was competent, confident, doing what the system rewarded. And I understood something important in that moment. No one at this company was intentionally suppressing me. They were simply optimizing for what I had shown them. And what I had shown them was stability without demand. The offer letter didn't make me angry at them. It made me responsible for myself. That evening, the recruiter called. "We're excited about you," she said. "But I need to know, are you serious about moving?" I appreciated the directness. "Yes," I said calmly, "I am." We discussed start dates, transition timelines, negotiable elements. I didn't negotiate aggressively. Not because I was timid, because the offer already reflected respect. I asked for minor clarifications, tightened a few details in writing, and by the end of the call, we had alignment. When I signed electronically later that night, I paused before clicking submit. It wasn't fear, it was gravity. I wasn't just accepting a job. I was ending an identity, the dependable backbone, the quiet fixer, the one who would always stay. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long time. There was no music playing, no celebratory ritual, just the steady awareness that the balance of power had shifted privately. They still thought I was permanent. They still thought I was patient. They still thought silence meant acceptance. And by the time they realized otherwise, it would already be decided. That was the power of the private reveal. No confrontation, no announcement, just a signature and certainty. After I signed, nothing changed on the surface. That was the strangest part. The next morning, I woke up at the same time, made the same tea, drove the same route to the same glass building. Externally, I was still Eliza's senior operations strategy manager, reliable, calm, present. Internally, the clock had started. My new company had proposed a start date 5 weeks out. Enough time to transition responsibly, enough time to leave cleanly, which meant I had a choice to make. Most people assume that once you have an offer, especially one that doubles your salary, the decision is obvious. It wasn't, because I wasn't leaving a toxic environment. I wasn't escaping cruelty. I wasn't storming out in protest. I was leaving familiarity, and familiarity has weight. I had relationships here, analysts who trusted me, cross-functional partners who depended on my precision. Even Greg, flawed as a leader in my trajectory, wasn't malicious. He had advocated for me within what he perceived as budget constraints. There were options. Option 1, leverage the offer internally. Ask for a counteroffer. Force recognition. Option 2, stay silent, leave gracefully, and let the market speak for me. Option 3, decline the new offer and renegotiate my scope more aggressively where I was. Each path had consequences. A counteroffer might increase my salary, but would it change perception? Or would I become the one who needed an external threat to be valued? Staying could preserve comfort, but would it alter the role I had already been assigned? Declining the offer felt safest emotionally, but safety was what had kept me static. I opened my notebook again. On one page, I wrote what changes if I stay. On the other, what changes if I leave. Under stay, most items required other people to evolve, leadership to reevaluate, budget allocations to expand, titles to shift. Under leave, the changes were immediate and structural. Authority, compensation, reporting line, scope. The more I looked at it, the clearer it became. One option depended on hope. The other depended on the decision. Later that week, Greg scheduled a one-on-one to discuss next quarter planning. As he spoke about future initiatives, he referenced projects that would expand my workload again. I see you taking on more cross-functional ownership. he said. "You're uniquely positioned." Uniquely positioned? I listened carefully. He wasn't offering a promotion. He wasn't outlining a compensation shift. He was assigning expansion under the same structure. In that moment, the decision solidified. Not emotionally, logically. If I accepted more responsibility without structural change now, I would reinforce the very pattern I had just broken privately. I realized something important. Leaving isn't betrayal when growth requires it. It's alignment. That afternoon, I drafted 2 documents. The first was a transition plan detailed professional, clean, active projects, risk flags, and recommended successors. The second was my resignation email. Short, precise, no accusations. I didn't send it yet. I read it several times over the next 2 days. Not to soften it, to ensure it carried no hidden resentment. Because this wasn't about proving a point. It was about choosing a trajectory. And once I chose, there was no version of me that would stay halfway. Some decisions are reversible. This one wasn't, and that was exactly why I chose it. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. That's the part people don't see. There was no dramatic countdown in my head. No secret smirk in meetings. Just logistics. I reviewed my employment agreement carefully. Non-compete clauses, confidentiality language, notice period requirements. I wasn't looking for loopholes, only clarity. The last thing I wanted was friction. Then I scheduled a brief consultation with an employment attorney. Not because I anticipated conflict, but because I believe in clean exits. 30 minutes, a few direct questions. "You're well within your rights," he confirmed. "Give proper notice. Don't take proprietary materials. Document your transition. You'll be fine." Fine. That word again, but this time it meant protected. At work, I began organizing shared drives with unusual thoroughness. I labeled folders more clearly than necessary, updated process documentation, cleaned up archived files. If someone opened my digital footprint after I left, I wanted it to reflect order, not absence. I also paid close attention to ongoing initiatives. There were 2 major projects, mid-cycle, both heavily dependent on my oversight. If I left abruptly, they would stall. That wasn't my goal. So I mapped contingency plans. Who could step in temporarily, where key assumptions lived? Which vendors required careful handling? Preparation isn't just about leverage. It's about integrity. In meetings, I remained steady. When someone suggested a timeline that I knew was optimistic, I flagged it just as I always had. When Daniel referenced our strategy, I nodded calmly. There was no need to reclaim credit anymore. I was already gone in principle. The most surreal part was how little anyone sensed it. Greg scheduled future-facing discussions. "We should think about your long-term trajectory here," he said one afternoon. I held his gaze. "Absolutely," I replied. It wasn't a lie. I was thinking about it. Just not here. In the evenings, I coordinated onboarding details with my new company. Equipment shipment, benefits enrollment, leadership introduction calls. Each email reinforced the shift. They addressed me as director. They asked for my perspective on structure before I had even started. Authority was assumed, not earned through years of quiet proving. Assumed. The contrast was sharp but not bitter. Just instructive. One night, I updated my personal financial spreadsheet. With the new compensation package, I could accelerate savings goals by years, increase investments, reduce long-term risk. The raise wasn't about lifestyle upgrades. It was about optionality. Freedom compounds faster than salary. By the time my final week approached, everything was in place. Transition document finalized, offer signed, start date confirmed. All that remained was the email. I chose Monday morning, not Friday afternoon, not late at night. Monday. Clear, direct, unambiguous. I scheduled a brief one-on-one with Greg for 9 o'clock. Then I set my resignation email to draft addressed to him and HR. Subject line simple resignation, Eliza Whitaker. I closed my laptop that Sunday evening with no ceremony, no music, no wine, no dramatic text to a friend. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful moves create no noise at all until they land. And when they land, they don't ask for permission. Monday morning felt unusually ordinary. The sky was gray, predictably Seattle. The office lights hummed the same way they always did. I placed my black notebook on the desk, opened my laptop, and reviewed my transition document one last time. At 8:57 FM, I walked to Greg's office. He looked up and smiled. "Morning," Come in. I closed the door gently behind me. I'll keep this straightforward, I said. My voice didn't shake. I've accepted another opportunity. I'll be submitting my formal resignation today. I'm providing 4 weeks' notice and a full transition plan. There was a pause, not dramatic, just disoriented. I'm sorry you're leaving, he asked. Yes. He blinked, recalibrating. I didn't see this coming. I believed him. That was the point. We spoke for about 15 minutes. He asked where I was going. I told him without specifics about compensation. He nodded slowly. This is about growth, he asked carefully. It is, I said. He leaned back, exhaled. We value you here, Eliza. I held his gaze. I know, and I did know. In their way, they valued me. But value without evolution had limits. At 9:23 a.m., I returned to my desk. At 9:24 I pressed send. My resignation email hit their inbox the same day. Within minutes, the internal messaging app began to flicker. Greg, can we talk again this afternoon? HR received. Let's schedule an exit conversation. Daniel, wait, is this real? The shift in tone was immediate. Don't panic yet. But disruption. By noon. Word had traveled beyond my immediate team. A few colleagues stopped by my desk. You're leaving, one analyst asked, eyes wide. Yes. Why, it's the right next step. I kept my answers simple. No grievances, no critiques. The consequences began subtly. A cross-functional meeting scheduled for Wednesday was abruptly postponed. Let's regroup after we understand coverage. Someone wrote. A project timeline was flagged for risk review. Suddenly, the invisible connective tissue I had been providing became visible through its absence. That afternoon, Greg called me back in. Is there anything we can do, he asked. It wasn't a counteroffer yet, more of an instinctive attempt to stabilize. I've made my decision, I said calmly, but I'm committed to ensuring a smooth transition. He studied me differently now, not as a steady constant, as a variable. Over the next few days, I noticed small shifts in behavior. People CC'd me more deliberately, as if trying to capture knowledge while they still could. Questions that had once been assumed now came explicitly. Where does that file live again? Can you walk me through that logic one more time? I answered everything patiently, not because I owed them beyond notice, but because leaving well matters. What struck me most wasn't anger or resentment from anyone. It was a surprise. They had built operational dependencies around my quiet reliability and never considered the cost of losing it. And here's the part no one says out loud. When a company underestimates someone long enough, they also underestimate the risk of their departure. By the end of that week, meetings had shifted tone. My input carried a new weight, not because I had changed, but because scarcity reframes value instantly. I wasn't louder. I was temporary, and suddenly I felt powerful. The counteroffer came the following Tuesday, not impulsively, not emotionally. Strategically late, Greg invited me into a conference room, this time neutral territory. HR joined us. Their posture was careful, measured. We've reviewed your trajectory and contributions, Greg began. We'd like to explore what it would take to keep you. Explore? HR slid a printed document across the table. A title adjustment, a compensation increase, a performance-based bonus structure. It was significant. Not double, but closer than I expected. 6 weeks earlier, that document would have felt like validation. Now it felt like confirmation. I looked at the numbers calmly. This is generous, I said sincerely. And I meant it. It wasn't insulting. It wasn't dismissive. It was reactive. Greg leaned forward slightly. We don't want to lose you. Eliza, you're critical here. Critical? The word echoed differently now. Critical employees aren't discovered during resignations. They're developed before them. I asked a single question. If I hadn't received another offer, would this conversation be happening? There was a pause. Not defensive, just honest. Greg didn't answer immediately. That silence told me everything. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't personal. It was structural. Budgets are stretched under threat. Titles evolve under pressure. Perception shifts when scarcity appears. But once someone has to threaten departure to be seen accurately, the dynamic changes permanently. HR spoke gently. We value loyalty. I nodded. So do I. Loyalty, I've learned, is mutual or it's conditional. They weren't wrong to operate within constraints, and I wasn't wrong to outgrow them. The panic didn't manifest as anger. It showed up as acceleration. Suddenly, I was invited to meetings I hadn't previously been included in, asked for perspective on long-term planning, consulted on hiring strategy. It was almost surreal. The access I had quietly wanted for years appeared in a matter of days. Not because I had developed new capabilities, because I had developed exit leverage. Colleagues who had once assumed my permanence now spoke with subtle urgency. "We really didn't realize how much you were carrying," one director admitted privately. I believed her. Underestimation is rarely loud. It's cumulative. Greg tried once more before the week ended. "If this is about compensation, we can revisit in 6 months," he offered carefully. 6 months. I thought about Tuesday morning in my kitchen, the 3.2% email, the years of steady overextension without structural recognition. 6 months wasn't a solution. It was a delay. "I've already signed," I said gently. The finality of that sentence settled the room. There was no hostility after that, just recalibration. The energy shifted from retention to containment. Transition plans were expedited. Knowledge transfers intensified. Questions multiplied. And here's the quiet truth. Once you decide to leave for alignment, not anger, nothing they offer feels urgent enough to reverse it. Because the decision wasn't about money alone. It was about identity. Staying after a counteroffer would have required me to believe that the same system that undervalued me for years would suddenly perceive me differently without the pressure of departure. I didn't believe that. Not cynically. Just realistically. By the end of that week, the tone had changed. No more persuasion. Just professionalism. They weren't villains scrambling. They were leaders, recognizing too late the cost of quiet competence. And I wasn't triumphant. I was steady. Because clarity doesn't gloat. It simply moves forward. My final week arrived without ceremony. No countdown on the office whiteboard. No awkward jokes about freedom. Just a steady series of handoffs and calendar blocks labeled knowledge transfer. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel asked if we could talk privately. We met in a small conference room, the kind usually reserved for quick syncs. He closed the door, then hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'll be honest," he said. "I didn't expect you to leave." "I know," I replied. He studied me, searching for something, resentment, perhaps, or accusation. "Was there something we missed?" he asked. The question wasn't defensive. It was confused. I considered my answer carefully. There were opportunities for structural growth that didn't materialize, I said evenly. And eventually, I stopped expecting them to. He nodded slowly. "I always thought you were solid," he said. "Like you'd always be here." Solid. It wasn't an insult. It was an assumption. "That's fair," I said. He leaned back. "For what it's worth, a lot of what I built here was possible because of your groundwork." It was the closest thing to direct acknowledgement I'd heard. I didn't need more. "Thank you," I said. There was no emotional release, no dramatic confession of overlooked credit, no tallying of past moments, because the purpose of that conversation wasn't correction. It was closure. Later that day, Greg scheduled one final one-on-one. This time, there was no attempt to retain me. "I want to understand," he said calmly, "so I don't repeat this." That mattered. "You relied on me heavily," I said. "But reliance isn't the same as advancement. At some point, stability without progression feels like a ceiling." He nodded, absorbing it. "I thought giving you autonomy was enough. It was valuable," I said. "But autonomy without structural recognition eventually plateaus." There was no accusation in my tone, just data. We talked about leadership blind spots, about how quiet contributors are often misread as content, about how compensation adjustments signal more than appreciation, they signal trajectory. Greg didn't defend himself. He listened. "I underestimated your threshold," he admitted quietly. That sentence lingered, not because it vindicated me, but because it confirmed something essential. They hadn't underestimated my capability. They had underestimated my willingness to leave. And that difference changes everything. When I stood to go, Greg extended his hand, then, after a brief pause, pulled me into a brief, professional hug. "You'll do well," he said. "I will," I replied. There was no heat in that room, no raised voices, no emotional climax. Just two professionals acknowledging a misalignment too late to correct. As I walked back to my desk for the last time, I felt lighter, not victorious, aligned. Sometimes confrontation isn't about volume. It's about clarity delivered without hostility. And when you leave without bitterness, The silence you once carried no longer feels heavy. It feels chosen. My first day in the new role felt unfamiliar in the best way. Not because the office was more modern or the title was longer, because I walked in without shrinking. Director of Operational Strategy. The words weren't aspirational here. They were literal. In my first executive meeting, the COO turned to me and said, "Eliza, what's your read?" Not as an afterthought, not as a validator. As a decision maker, I answered without softening my conclusions. "We're underestimating integration risk by about 12%, I said calmly. "If we move forward without restructuring the onboarding sequence, we'll bottleneck within 2 quarters. No one rebranded it. No one translated it. No one claimed it. They asked follow-up questions. They adjusted the plan. That was the difference. Respect wasn't louder here. It was structural. My compensation changed my savings account. Yes. But more importantly, my authority changed my posture. I noticed it in small ways. I no longer over-prepared to justify my presence. I prepared because clarity matters not, because I feared invisibility. I delegated without apology. I asked for resources directly. And when something fell outside my scope, I said, "That's not aligned with our current priorities," without cushioning it in self-deprecation. The quiet dominance I had always carried internally finally had an environment that recognized it. But here's what surprised me most. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt accountable, because once you step into a role that matches your capability, excuses disappear. You can't blame ceiling effects. You can't blame invisibility. You perform or you don't. And I did. Within 6 months, we restructured 2 underperforming divisions. Not dramatically, methodically. Clear metrics, transparent communication, shared credit. I was careful about one thing. I never allowed someone steady and quiet on my team to become invisible. If an analyst built the framework, I named them in the room. If someone stabilized a volatile situation, I attached their name to the outcome in writing. Not performatively, intentionally, because I understood how easy it is for competence to be absorbed into the background. The biggest change, though, wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer confuse patience with passivity. I no longer assume recognition will self-correct, and I no longer equate loyalty with permanence. Who I am now isn't louder than who I was. She's clearer. Clear about value, clear about limits, clear about when to stay and when to move. Sometimes people ask if I regret not negotiating harder before leaving. I don't, because the lesson wasn't about squeezing more from a structure that had already defined me. It was about choosing one that aligned with who I was becoming. They laughed when I asked for a raise. A competitor doubled my salary. But the real shift wasn't the number. It was the moment I stopped asking rooms that had already decided who I was and started choosing rooms that hadn't. And that choice changed everything. When I look back now, I don't replay the laughter. It wasn't cruel laughter. It wasn't even loud. It was the kind of soft, dismissive amusement people use when they think a request is optimistic. They laughed when I asked for a raise. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter, that I was above needing validation, that good work would eventually convert into recognition. But here's what I understand now. Work doesn't automatically speak. Structures speak. Incentives speak. Leverage speaks. Silence can be strength, but only when it's chosen, not assumed. For years, I believed endurance was proof of professionalism, that staying calm, staying steady, staying loyal would naturally create upward momentum. What it actually created was comfort. For them, and comfort in organizations rarely creates urgency. A competitor doubled my salary. My resignation email hit their inbox the same day. But the email wasn't revenge. It was alignment. There's a difference between leaving to prove a point and leaving because the point has already been proven. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because I finally measured myself honestly. And when you measure honestly, you can't negotiate against your own evidence anymore. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Being calm does not mean being small. Being loyal does not mean being permanent. Being indispensable does not mean being irreplaceable. And if you ever realize that a room has grown comfortable with underestimating you, you don't have to argue with it. You can simply outgrow it. I'm not angry at the people I left behind. In some ways, I'm grateful. They taught me the difference between appreciation and advancement. Now I build teams differently. I name quiet contributors, I attach credit accurately, I correct underleveling before it calcifies, because someone once underestimated my threshold, and that was their lesson. So here's my question for you. Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have not because you lacked options, but because you underestimated your own leverage? I'd genuinely like to know.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.